If you're on Facebook, now you can follow Notebook on Cities and Culture on its official Facebook page. Take a look at facebook.com/Notebook on Cities and Culture. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. There was one thing you were talking about off mic just before, and that I feel like I should start here. It's the comparison of the analogy of the Kyoto geisha and the English gentleman. How does this work?
Well, it seems to me that there's two island cultures. There's Britain and Japan, and they both have produced distinctive culture. And in terms of human beings, you can say that the English gentleman is the quintessence of traditional English culture. And in terms of Japan, the geisha embodies the quintessence of Japanese culture. And they're, in a sense, although obviously they're male and female, and though they're so very different, the gentleman and the geisha, they do have a lot in common because they're both bound by ritual, regulation, and repression of the self.
Oh, the three R's.
The 3 R's?
Ritual, regulation, repression.
Ah, right. Very good. The English gentleman is based on the model of self-control. The geisha is based on the model of acting, I would say. But in a sense, the English gentleman is also an act because he has to look like a gentleman and behave like a gentleman and dress like a gentleman, even if within himself he is nothing like a gentleman. So both of them are performance-related. Both of them are living within certain rules, and both of them, I think, have been much admired throughout the world.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in Kawaramachi in Kyoto, Japan, with John Dougill. He's a professor of British culture at Ryukoku University. He's the author of books like Kyoto, A Cultural History, as well as In Search of Japan's Hidden Christians more recently. And he's also written books on an entirely different subject, Oxford in English Literature, for example. We'll touch on all these subjects, all these places. He's also, he runs the blog Green Shinto, so there's indeed an interest in religion to complement all of this, and I want to stay on this topic a bit longer and wonder what you think of the old Donald Ritchie quote where he says that in Japan, appearances are reality. How well does that jibe with what you've just said?
It jibes absolutely. I'm a great fan of Donald Ritchie, of course, and he was kind enough to write the foreword for my book. When I first came to Japan in 1986, I had great difficulty in understanding what was going on. I read every single book about Japan that I could, and it was only when I really understood that appearance is reality in Japan, things began to make sense. What is really important in Japan is form over function. That is so different from what we are brought up to believe in the West, particularly, I think, in America, where Britain took a lot of its values from in the post-war period. In America and Britain, we treasure authenticity and action. But in Japan, form is important. Doesn't matter how you feel, doesn't matter what you think, you have to look and behave in the right way. And if you do so, you are successful.
Form over function. Tell me something you didn't understand when you got to Japan that was strange to you at first and was then cleared up by understanding appearances are reality, in Ritchie's words.
There are so many examples. I was walking about the first week in Japan. I was walking down the street, saw somebody coming towards me with a large Union Jack on their T-shirt. So I thought I'd speak to them. I said, hello, have you been to England? Are you a fan of Great Britain? And they reacted with sheer terror, as first of all, because I was speaking to them and I was a total stranger. Secondly, because I was speaking English, which they found very challenging. And third of all, it was such a strange question, because what you wear is a matter of form. It's not that you're sending a message to the world. Right. It's because it looks nice.
This was not indicative of Anglophilia in any sense.
Absolutely. It was no connection with England whatsoever. It was just pretty colours. And Japanese do this all the time. For example, there was a famous love hotel in Kanazawa which had a Statue of Liberty on its roof. And I asked people many times, why have you got the Statue of Liberty on the Love Hotel? Is it suggestive of freedom? Freedom to make love? And of course, this question was so strange for Japanese. The only reason the Statue of Liberty was on the roof, because it looks nice.
Right. It's because they wanted the Statue of Liberty on the roof. It's no more complicated than that, was it?
Right.
Tell me how and why you got to Japan in 1986. Before recording, I believe you described it as a bit of an uprooting. What was the reason for that?
Well, it was very simple. I was teaching English in Oxford in a language school. I was trying to make a living actually from writing EFL textbooks. It took a lot of time and I was getting very little money. And then one day I happened to walk into a school and there was a woman there saying, do you know anybody who would like to work in Japan? It's very little work and it's a lot of money. I thought, that sounds very appealing. I think I'll try that. So I applied for the job and got it. It was at a small town on the Japan Sea called Kanazawa. As it happens, it's a very attractive castle town, and it's one of the several towns in Japan known as Small Kyoto, because it has much of Kyoto culture in it.
What does it mean to have Kyoto culture in it? How does that manifest itself?
Well, Kyoto culture is to do with the long centuries during which Kyoto developed a very particular aesthetics of its own. And that aesthetics is found, for example, in Japanese gardens, in Japanese art, in the geisha, in the kaiseki ryori, the Japanese food. These are wonderful cultural attributions which Japan has given to the world, and they were born and came out of Kyoto, including no theatre as well.
What is the shape of the road for you then? What was the shape of the road for you from Kanazawa, where you find elements of Kyoto culture, to the actual Kyoto, where we sit now?
Well, that was pure chance, in fact. I was isolated in Kanazawa, really. As a foreigner, there were very few foreigners, and the Japanese were not used to foreigners and therefore treated them as rather strange aliens. So I didn't feel comfortable there. And fortunately for me, a job came up in Kyoto, and I'd visited Kyoto several times. There used to be a gathering every month organised by Ken Rogers called the Kyoto Connection, where foreigners and Japanese put on performances of all kinds, musical, theatrical, magic. And I came down from Kanazawa especially for those gatherings, saw how attractive Kyoto was, how easy it was to live here as a foreigner. I remember, actually, one of the first times I came to Kyoto, I went into a shop to buy something, and the guy just handed it to me, and I left the shop, and I realised that it was just like a normal transaction in the West. I was so used in Kanazawa to something strange happening, whereas people would kind of get very tense, or they'd say, no, I don't speak English, even though I was talking Japanese. Yes. So I realised that in Kyoto a foreigner can live quite normally and pleasantly, whereas in Kanazawa, because it's isolated, because Japan is such a mono-racial society, foreigners are very special.
Now, even in Kyoto, a place where it's easier for a foreigner to live, what was required for you to get a handle on Japan, to make it a place that to take the strangeness away from it?
Some foreigners manage to live in big cities like Kyoto and Tokyo without ever getting a handle on Japan. They live,
Tokyo especially, I hear.
Yeah, they live as if they're living in the West. So I think in the big cities, because they're cosmopolitan, because there are a lot of foreigners, it's in a sense more difficult to get a handle on Japan, or it's not so necessary to get a handle on Japan. But for me, getting a handle on Japan had to do with writing this book about Kyoto. I'd been in Kyoto for 7 years and I'd got the 7-year itch, and I was thinking about going to South America because it's the only continent in which I haven't lived. And I was thinking about universities in South America, getting a little bit restless when I was asked by a publisher in Britain to write the book about Kyoto. And it was then that I started to do research about the cultural heritage of Kyoto. It was as if the scales were lifted from my eyes. I suddenly realized what a magnificent city I am living in. I live right next to a World Heritage Site. I cycle to work along the river. I work right next to another World Heritage Site. Everywhere I go, I'm surrounded by history. Suddenly, I realize that I'm living in a kind of magical paradise. And that was really a key turning point for me. Ever since then, I count my blessings every day that I'm living here.
A magical paradise. Now, I take it because you found this through writing a book that indeed the natives, the Japanese-born Kyoto residents themselves may be blind to certain magical qualities of this place as well. Or is it possible to know that?
Yes, I certainly think so, because I have a girlfriend who was born and brought up in Kyoto, and she thinks it's just ordinary and not very interesting city. For her, it's just normal reality. It often takes an outsider to see places for what they really are, I think.
And I want to know a little bit about what it took, what research directions you had to go in to write this book on Kyoto. Where did you set out intellectually first to shore up your knowledge of the place?
Well, obviously I read whatever books were available, but the main element of my research was visiting every place that I could. This is an enormous undertaking. Kyoto has something like 76 historical gardens, umpteen temples and shrines, museums galore of all different kinds, a whole 5 different geisha area. So what I did every weekend, and very often during the week as well, I went to visit these places. I spoke to whoever I could who was in charge of running them, asked them difficult questions, and slowly developed a huge number of files which are still sitting on my shelves.
There's this, you of course write about it in the book, but there's the sense that Kyoto, like no other city in Japan, puts old and new right up against each other. Some writers, some commentators say that that's a terrible thing. Some find it fascinating. How do you think of the juxtaposition of old and new in your experience of Kyoto?
Well, I've been ambivalent, actually, and I've swung both ways. As a British person, I'm naturally inclined towards tradition and traditional architecture and sympathetic architecture. And I find much of modern architecture to be unpleasant or not very pleasing. Kyoto certainly has awful modern architecture. If you go to somewhere like Shanghai, even I am lost for words at how stunning some of the modern buildings are and those skyscrapers. And driving around Shanghai at night is quite a trip with the changing colours. I'm not sure if you've been there, but
No.
Osaka too has some pretty stunning modern architecture. Tokyo, actually, even I, as a traditionalist, have to admit, is very, very pleasing modern architecture. Kyoto does not, and I'm not sure why, but I've been told that it's simply because it's not a capital city, because it's not a main city. Companies are not willing to invest money into design of the buildings. So what we get instead are very ugly, square, rectangular blocks, which even I could design with a ruler and a piece of paper. So there's no doubt that modern Kyoto is a mess, and it's a sprawling urban mess, and not commensurate with the heritage that Kyoto has. It's often said that Americans spared Kyoto during the war by not bombing it, that the Japanese destroyed it afterwards. And when you see some of the traditional architecture in Gion, the one or two streets that still remain of the wooden houses in the geisha area, then you do feel pangs of pain for the beauty that has been lost. Having said that, what's wonderful about Kyoto is that there are these little nuggets of treasures set around the city, that in this urban sprawl, in this concrete jungle, there are these wonderful temples and shrines and hidden gardens that are really delightful, and which one feels great pleasure in coming across and discovering for oneself.
I take it you might sign on to the proposition then that the Japanese don't quite know what they have in Kyoto.
I think that's certainly true in the 1950s and 60s, when they were looking to modernize and get away from a past which they saw as primitive and rather shameful. I think nowadays there's much more awareness and pride in traditional Japanese heritage.
You mentioned as a British person you are inclined away from modern architecture. Am I correct to say that Britain was especially poorly served by modern architecture?
Well, when you travel around Germany and you see some of the conservation that was done in the German villages, Britain has been very poorly served by supermarkets and 1960s buildings which act as a blight upon many of the traditional small towns in Britain. I don't think there's any doubt about that. If you go to London, what do you look at? You look at the traditional places and you feel happy to see them. I don't feel that much pleasure or happiness when I see modern architecture in London. I may say that's interesting, but I don't feel that warm glow of pleasure that some of the traditional architecture gives me.
Right. Would it be correct to say that you have two cities, Kyoto and Oxford? Is that so?
That's certainly true.
What do these? Tell me their relation to each other in your mind, in your life, the way that you, the roles they play in your life or have played, relative to each other perhaps, or just individually, or however you want to frame it.
Oxford became my home after I taught for 3 years in the Middle East. I was in Bahrain and Kuwait, where the desert, as we know, plays a large part in the geographical terrain. When I went back to Britain, I didn't have a hometown as such, because I'd left my hometown of Grimsby, a small fishing port. Well, it used to be a very big fishing port, but now it's a small town on the east coast. So I was looking for somewhere that would be an antidote to the Middle East, and somewhere with greenery and with old houses. And I spent 1 year as a graduate student in Oxford, so I thought of Oxford, went there, felt immediately at home, lived there for over 7 years, absolutely loved it. It's my kind of town. It's a small university town. young people and old buildings, in my opinion, make the best form of town. It's so much going on there. There's arts, classical concerts. I was involved in community affairs. I wrote a couple of guidebooks about famous people who lived in Oxford and a literary history of Oxford. So I must say I felt completely comfortable and actually love for Oxford. So when I took the job in Japan, and I took the job because of the opportunity as a career move, it offered me a visiting professorship in Kanazawa, which I eagerly seized. But as the years went on, after 2 years, 3 years, I realised with much pain that I was being uprooted from Oxford, that I was losing touch with my hometown, that friends were becoming more distant, and that was a painful process. And the whole process of cultural assimilation into Japan was quite traumatic for me in a way, and it led me to read books on the subject and to take an interest in what I was feeling, because I had fairly turbulent feelings inside, feelings of isolation and sometimes feelings of anger towards Japan, which I didn't fully understand myself.
You mentioned reading books on the subject specifically of being thrust into the culture of Japan and having to cope. Were those the matter of the books you were reading at that period?
No, I was reading books by Reischauer on how to understand Japan and the Japanese. There are several best-selling books about how to look at Japan and how to understand Japanese values. So they were more factual books that I was reading. There was one very good novel written by an Englishman, Pictures from the Water Trade, I think. That was the only fiction that I read.
Now, as far as being in this culture goes, tell me, what has been your experience of being a representative of British culture here in Japan?
Funnily enough, I didn't feel particularly British when I came, because my mother was Czechoslovakian and I lived in Germany and the Middle East for a while. So I felt more cosmopolitan than specifically British, but coming to Japan made me feel my Britishness, because the Japanese always ask you, where do you come from? And then you say Britain, and then they come up with some stereotype like, oh, you must love the Queen, or I think you like roast beef, or
Marmite, I don't know.
Marmite. Well, they didn't know Marmite actually, but I introduced some of them to Marmite and they found it quite disgusting. Oh. So that actually was nice, because the Japanese always do that to foreigners. They say, do you like natto, fermented soybean? And they're very happy if you don't like natto, because that reflects on how special Japanese are. So when I found out that they didn't like Marmite, that one of them actually rushed out of the room and spat it into the toilet, I actually felt the same thing. I felt quite happy and proud to be British, that we have Marmite.
As an American lover of both Marmite and natto, I suppose I displease everybody, but I don't care. I get great pleasure from both of those foods, or both. Like Marmite is more of an addition to food. But I wonder, you mentioned the young man you met when you came here who had the Union Jack on his shirt, but was not an Anglophile by any means. I mean, Japan does have a strain of Anglophilia running through it in some sense, doesn't it? Or at least Western love of Western Europe and their idea of it.
That's absolutely true, and I must say, we Westerners or Anglo-Saxons are very privileged in Japan, overprivileged, I would say. We're treated with far too much respect and deference, and we have a high status because Japan largely took Britain as a model after the Meiji Restoration, and then took America as a model after the Second World War. So, for example, I'm sometimes walking down the street and I'll see a shop window and there'll be a United States flag, a Union Jack and the Japanese flag. 3 flags hanging in a window.
The complete trifecta right there.
Yeah, I think, and in a way, it reflects the Japanese distorted view of the world. They think that every foreigner is an Anglo-Saxon of some kind, or thinks like an Anglo-Saxon. So they create a dichotomous world between Anglo-Saxons, Americans, or British. Usually, nowadays it's usually American model. We Japanese do think like this, but you, rest of the world, meaning American or Anglo-Saxons, you think like that. We eat rice, but you eat bread. And they think every foreigner eats bread.
Yes, I know. You get half a loaf whenever you sit down, I think, just because, it must be the equivalent of rice, right? If we have rice every meal, you have bread every meal, right?
That's right, yes. And you'll often, for example, go to a Japanese banquet and very kindly they'll come and give you a knife and fork, even though you've been living here 20 years.
I introduced you as a professor of British culture, so you have in an official capacity, you're also a representative of British culture. I mean, what are the most resonant ways to offer British culture to Japanese students?
Well, one thing I like to do is to point out the similarities between Britain and Japan. The whole of their education system and the whole of their culture system is built on the opposition that we are different, and it's very difficult to understand their way of thinking. But what I like to do is to start with the commonalities. Actually, Britain and Japan have so much in common. We have a very similar timescale to our history. We both island cultures. We both have a sort of distant relationship to the continent to which we're attached. We've both been dominated by the culture of that continent. We both have 4 seasons. We have similar attitude to nature. We have a royalty and a hierarchical society. And we both, each in our own way, have a kind of tea culture.
Yes, indeed.
So there's so much we have in common, and when this is pointed out to the students, they go, oh, I see, oh. Maybe it's not so strange and different after all.
We were discussing before recording a paper you wrote on Oxford and Kyoto, and what resonances between them do you find?
Well, in that paper I was looking at Oxford and Kyoto as both representative cities of their distinctive cultures. Obviously, Kyoto has been the ancient capital, whereas Oxford is known as a university town, so the scales are quite different. In fact, Kyoto is 10 times or 8 or 9 times bigger than Oxford. Oxford is a very small town of 140,000. But nonetheless, I think we can find that Oxford has been identified with the elite of Britain, or England, I should say, over the last 1,000 years, and as such it's been representative of the culture. Of course, Kyoto has been the leading city in terms of developing Japanese culture too. So, as I mentioned before, the English gentleman, if we can say that, is representative of English culture. That very much came out of Oxford. That idea was very much part of education in Oxford. There's one quotation I have from a 19th century teacher at Oxford University who actually says to his students, "You're not here so much as to acquire information, you're here to be trained as English gentlemen and to go out and to rule the world." And similarly in Kyoto, in Japan, if we can say the geisha is representative of this form over function element. and of Japanese aesthetics in general, the geisha also developed in Kyoto. So I think both towns have contributed much to what we could say to the cultural essence of their respective countries.
People think of both England and Japan as being distinctively irreligious places, but you've written a book on Japan's hidden Christians. You have the blog Green Shinto. Clearly, you have an interest on how religion does surface here in Japan. How did that interest form for you?
That's a good question. That interest formed for me basically from the 1970s when I was a young hippie taking part in early Glastonbury festivals where I made friends with people in the nascent neo-pagan movement, which has since spread and become such a big phenomenon in Britain and America. And I was very attracted to earth religions, natural religion, and paganism, ancient paganism. I forgot about that during my middle decades, but coming to living in Japan and being surrounded by Shinto made me realize that there's a strong commonality between ancient paganism in Europe and modern Shinto in Japan. So I started investigating that, and the more I investigated, the more fascinated I became, and the more I became intrigued by the idea that at the root of Japanese culture lies the Japanese religion, and the Japanese religion is Shinto rather than Zen. As you know, there's a famous book by D.T. Suzuki claiming that Zen is the very essence of the Japanese heart and of Japanese culture. I am very convinced now that actually that should be Shinto, not Zen, and that even Zen itself owes a lot to the influence of what we call Shinto.
Shinto, then, in some sense, remains alive in the Japanese population, even for those who are not diehard followers of it?
Yes, I believe so. It's such a big question because there are people who dispute that Shinto is a religion, that it's merely part of the Japanese culture. I'm sure you've visited many shrines yourself, and you've seen how Japanese clap their hands, pray, offer money, and buy fortune slips. Yes. Every Japanese does it. If you ask any of those Japanese, are you religious, do you believe in the kami, I think you'll find 90% of them will say no.
Yes, my Japanese friends do it, and I know for a fact they don't think about religion ever,
So then we have to ask the question, what is religion, and what does religion mean? Is Shinto a religion? And there are different answers that can be given to that. Some people would say it's not so much a religion as a custom. It's, in a sense, you can equate it to celebrating Christmas. All the people who celebrate Christmas in the West, are they Christian? No, of course they're not. So why are they celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ?
Right, and here, why are they eating Kentucky Fried Chicken on that day? I guess I know why that happened. It's a canny marketing move by KFC, but I'm reminded of a line I hear observers of Japan say often, which is that the Japanese pick their religions for every occasion. They sort of shift from religion to religion based on exactly what they need or need to do in the moment. Does that strike you as accurate?
Yes, I think that's very accurate, that there's a well-known saying, you're born Shinto and die Buddhist. So the rites of passage, like coming of age and getting married, they're traditionally associated with Shinto, but anything to do with death and the afterlife are consigned to Buddhism. So the same individual will happily take their child for the first blessing at a Shinto shrine, they'll get married in a Christian chapel, and they'll have a Buddhist funeral, and they won't think there's anything odd or peculiar about it, because at heart, Japanese are basically syncretic and polytheistic. Polytheistic means recognizing different gods all have their own validity, even when there are contradictory elements between them. And that's one thing very difficult for foreigners who are not familiar with Asia to understand, that it's possible to hold mutually contradictory truths, to reconcile them and not to be disturbed by them. We in the West are so brought up to believe that there is only one truth, and therefore we want to find that one truth, and we want to be true to that one truth. Japanese think that's a very strange idea, and that there are many truths which are all equally valid at the same time. And having lived now in Japan for over 20 years, I have come to agree with the Japanese. So in that sense, I've been culturally assimilated and deracinated from my own culture.
There came a point then when you found you could hold these myriad opposing ideas in your head at once. You realized you could do that?
Yes, but there wasn't a sudden moment of realization. I think I slowly took it on board, and that it was a valid way of looking at the world. Whereas when I first came to Japan, I was very Western. I was very insistent on right and wrong, and this is correct and this is not correct, and there is only one truth. But I think I've adapted more to in sympathy with the Japanese way now, and that's one thing that I like about Shinto. Shinto recognizes many different kami, and Shinto leaves it up to you. If you believe in Buddhism or Christianity or Islam, doesn't matter, you can still follow Shinto. And I like that idea as well.
And that said, what got you on the track of Christianity in Japan?
Well, it was just the fascination with the story of the hidden Christians that I came upon. I was reading a novel, a well-known novel by Endo Shusaku called Silence, which Martin Scorsese's been wanting to film for about 20 years now. I hope he's going to make it. I don't know if he will. And I was fascinated by that, and I read more, and I read about the story of hidden Christians, and it was just such an absolutely fascinating story, that these people, these were illiterate peasants who'd been terribly persecuted, tortured, killed, horrible things happened to them, but still, for 7 generations, in secret, at the risk of death, they'd passed down a foreign religion. They had no Bible, they had no priests, they were just handing it down by word of mouth from father to son until the 1860s, when they were found, or they revealed themselves to a French missionary priest, and it was then discovered that something like 60,000 of these people were still practicing what they termed Christianity, but which in fact turned out to be a mix of Catholic teachings that had been handed down like Chinese whispers, that had integrated elements of Shinto and Buddhism as well, and had become basically a folk religion of its own. And because it had become its own folk religion, many of them refused to rejoin the Catholic Church when they had the chance, and the very last generation now are still practicing the religion that's been handed down to them for 8 or 9 generations. And when I realized that this is the last chance, the last generation, I thought I must go and find out, I must go and talk to them, I must see for myself some of the places associated with this story, because it's just so extraordinary, and yet it's not that well known.
The hidden Christianity then became its own it evolved away, it branched off, it became its own religion, and we're nearing the end of its practice, I suppose, if its practitioners are passing on then.
Yes, many of the practitioners now are 80 years old, 60, 70, 80 years old, and their children are either not interested or have moved away. And once the children move away, there's no possibility for them to practice in the sense of a group or other practitioners, so the religion withers and dies. So the people that are really traditionally following what their parents told them, who memorized the oratio, the prayers that were handed down by word of mouth, sometimes with completely meaningless words that mix elements of Portuguese with Japanese, like some sort of magical incantation, no meaning, but to them it's sacred, the sacred words of God. These people are less than 1,000 now, and nearly all of them are over 50.
You mentioned something about your life in Kyoto, which is that you live by one UNESCO World Heritage Site and you work by another one, and you're working on a book now about World Heritage Sites. Tell me what does that proximity? I mean, did that proximity to these sites get you fired up about such a project, or is it? Tell me a little bit about what it's like, I guess, to live near those and to be working on a project about the general concept of them.
Well, I can't say that living near a World Heritage Site gets me excited, because to me it's just the view out of the window. But what did get me excited was when I read about the 16 World Heritage Sites in Japan, some of which were, I've lived here for 20 years, but some of them I didn't know anything about. Iwami silver mines, for example, never heard of them. Ogasawara Islands, the Galapagos of the East, as they're called. I started reading about some of these places and realized how special they were. And a lot of them are off the beaten track. They're not on the tourist trail. Of course, Kyoto and Nara are very world famous, but places like Shiritoko, Shirakami-sanchi, these are not household names, and many Japanese themselves have not been there. When I discovered the wealth of places that are World Heritage Sites in Japan and the diversity, that got me excited.
And what does it mean for a place to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site? You know, as long as we're talking about that, it's both. I mean, whether I don't know whether I mean technically what does it take, or what does it mean for a place to become that. But when a place becomes that, what happens?
Well, basically, you're inscribed by UNESCO on a list, and it means that the management of that heritage site has responsibility to protect and preserve the heritage as it is and pass it on to future generations. So you're not allowed to make modernizations or to alter the structure. You're not allowed to. There are a lot of rules and regulations governing the protection of those sites. Now, certain problems. I've just been to a conference in Kyoto which was held for the last 3 days, actually, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Convention concerning World Heritage Sites. And there are now 962 World Heritage Sites around the world. And they talked about some of the challenges, and the challenges are how to preserve a place without making it into a museum piece and without making it to the detriment of the people who live in that area, because those people in that area have to have a lifestyle that's commensurate with the modern world. It may be impossible for them to sustain a traditional economy, for example, when the rest of society has moved on. So there's very often a kind of tension between the authorities who wish to preserve the World Heritage Site and the local inhabitants, the community who live there, who wish to modernise in the same way as everybody else in the country in which they live.
I hear people complain about, for example, Italian cities that have become open-air museums. I mean, is that a fate that Japanese cities wish to avoid as well?
Yes, very much so. I've just been to a charming place in the Gifu Mountains called Shirakawa-go, which has traditional prayer hands housing, very tall roofs in order to withstand the winter snows. And I did get the feeling that the villages there had been turned to some extent into tourist villages, that the traditional heritage lifestyle, no longer existed, that they were living off tourism, and to some extent that it wasn't preserving a traditional lifestyle, it was preserving picturesque villages that had become tourist traps. And I did feel a bit ambivalent about the effect that the World Heritage status had there in terms of bringing outsiders into the community without actually giving the community the means to keep supporting themselves without tourism. They've now become dependent on tourism, and that's not healthy.
To go to a previously mentioned ambivalence of yours about modern architecture in Kyoto, despite what that may or may not have done to the city, people seem to have varying opinions. Do you consider yourself optimistic about Kyoto now and about the way that foreigners and Japanese alike have begun to approach the city and regard it in this century?
Yes, I think there are grounds now for much greater optimism than there were 20 years ago, for example. There's much more awareness of the heritage of Kyoto, much more desire to protect, and this is reflected above all in one vital aspect, which is to do with the so-called machiya, which are wooden traditional buildings. Kyoto used to be a city of all wooden buildings at one time, and some of the best examples were the merchants' houses with their own particular architecture, which has small gardens in the middle and at the back. And these wonderful old machiya, which are very pleasant places indeed, were being torn down at a ferocious rate. They still are being torn down, but not so much as before, and there are now efforts by Japanese to preserve them and to remake them into restaurants. So there are some very trendy Italian and French restaurants in these traditional Japanese houses now, which are very attractive indeed.
Yes, I've walked by a couple of those. They do. It's intriguing to see that the cultural contrast. I mean, that seems like something the younger generations of Japanese are very much into. Is taking the traditional, their own heritage and perhaps hybridizing that with the affinity they have for Europe or elsewhere. No.
Yes, that's absolutely true, but it's also true of the age we live in. We live in a global postmodern age, and I think you'll find the same thing in America, where Americans happily go and eat sushi from to sushi bar or go to a Japanese rock garden and don't think anything strange about it.
We eat more sushi than the Japanese do, it seems like. It's not that common here, is it?
It's not that common in Kyoto, certainly, because we're not by the sea.
Right, indeed. Now, at the beginning, we talked about the uprooting of moving from Oxford to Japan, and at the end, tell me about the reverse uprooting. I suppose the roots have grown for you in Kyoto. What does it feel like to go back to Oxford now, where you have a home?
Well, that's an intriguing question. Basically, I see my own country through Japanese eyes now, so I go back to Britain and I'm quite alienated by the rudeness and the dirtiness and the lack of efficiency. it doesn't look as attractive a place as the place that I grew up in. And I'm quite happy to get back to Japan where everything's clean, orderly, and is going to function properly.
The Britain is not Britain as it was for you?
No, not at all. No, it's become rather uncouth.
You can be optimistic then about Kyoto, but the optimism is not quite in such force when you think about even Oxford.
That's true, yes. This summer I went back to southwest England, to Devon and Dorset, and I must say I did fall in love with the English countryside all over again. I think the English countryside is very pleasant and I could easily live there. I'm not sure how I deal with the relative cultural isolation, but I think the pace of life and the people are much more pleasant and human than in the cities, and Oxford has become rather overrun with foreign young tourists. It's actually difficult to walk up the main street of Oxford, even though they've banned the traffic now.
It's become a tourist town.
It always was a tourist town, and now it's become a swamped by tourist town.
But in contrast to Kyoto, it seems like tourists love to come here or want to come here, but it's not. It seems by no means swamped by tourists here.
Yes, I think that's true, because Kyoto's just a much bigger city. It's 1.25 million. Oxford is 140,000, and it's only got one main street.
No, yes, there's certainly a difference in size, and it keeps. I'll say this: I understand why you've spent more time in Kyoto, given all that.
Right, and now I have 5 years left until retirement, and I have to make a decision at some point whether to retire back to my own house in Oxford or stay in Kyoto. And at the moment, I'm looking at 50-50.
50-50. Well, I've been sitting here 7 stories above Kawaramachi in Kyoto, Japan, with John Dougill, professor of British culture at Ryukoku University, and he's also the author of Kyoto, A Cultural History, or if you have the UK edition, Kyoto, Cities of the Imagination, or Kyoto in the Cities of the Imagination series. He's also the author of books like In Search of Japan's Hidden Christians and Oxford and English Literature, and he's working on a book now about UNESCO heritage sites. John, thanks so much.
Thank you. This was good fun.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Millman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.